Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us at Blockchain Week. In this session, we're joined with our keynote speaker, Evan Gallagher. Evan is the Principal Specialist Policies at AUSTRAC. Following Evan's presentation, we'll continue on with today's FATF and the travel rule discussion. It'll be led by Ron Tucker, the founder and chairman emeritus of Blockchain Australia. The virtual stage is yours, Evan.
Thank you, and thank you for having me to talk to you today. Today, I'd like to take you inside the mind of an anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing regulator. As Australia's representative on the Financial Action Task Force's Virtual Assets Contact Group, I want to show you what keeps us awake at night, quite literally in my case, as meetings often don't finish until 2 or 3 in the morning. And I can assure you that there is no more fun way to spend a Friday night than a Zoom call to discuss financial regulation. I'm only half joking. Like a lot of us working in this space, I'm really fascinated by the technologies underlying virtual assets and the possibilities they represent. But I should start by setting out what is the Financial Action Task Force, or the FATF. The FATF is the intergovernmental standard and policy setting body for anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing, and counter-proliferation financing. The FATF's 40 recommendations, FATF assessment methodology, and other documents are referred to collectively as the FATF Standards. While these are recommendations, almost every jurisdiction in the world has committed to implementing them. And through a process of peer review, every jurisdiction is held publicly accountable for how well they do so. You can view the FATF Standards as a roadmap for where AML-CTF regulation is going globally. The costs of not implementing them can be significant, including public criticism of countries, and increasing costs for businesses in non-compliant jurisdictions who may find their access to the global financial system affected. The FATF standards represent both best practice and also an accountability mechanism to protect the global financial system from financial crime. So in 2019, the FATF updated its standards to require the countries regulate virtual asset service providers, also known as VASPs, for AML-CTF purposes. The term VASP is largely synonymous with what we call digital currency exchanges in Australia. Generally, the FATF standards apply to VASPs in the same way as they do to other businesses in the financial sector. Under the standards, VASPs should assess and understand their money laundering, terrorism financing, and proliferation financing risks. They should undertake customer due diligence so that they know who their customers are and can identify when the customer's behaviour is suspicious. The FATF also requires that VASP must be licensed or registered by a government authority and subject to fit and proper person checks to ensure that criminals and their associates are kept out of the sector. One requirement in particular has, however, gained a lot of public attention since the new standards were introduced, and that is the requirement that countries extend the travel rule to VASPs. In practice, this means that when VASPs send virtual assets to another VASP or financial institution on behalf of their customers, countries will require them to immediately and securely transmit information about the payer and payee in the transaction. Now, it's worth noting the travel rule is applied for decades to banks when sending fiat currency. You might well ask, what's the point of the travel rule? Put simply, it's about ensuring end-to-end transparency of a transaction for the businesses involved in making it happen. It also means that authorities can request that information from businesses in their jurisdictions when investigating financial crime. End-to-end transparency is first and foremost about risk mitigation. Money laundering risk, terrorism financing risk, proliferation financing risk, and very relevant right now, sanctions risk. Any business that engages in transactions without knowing who the parties to that transaction are can be taking on a significant risk. The pseudo-anonymous nature of most virtual assets makes the travel rule particularly relevant. By increasing end-to-end transparency of transactions, the travel rule could assist you to understand if a person or entity who is listed for targeted financial sanctions or one of their associates is involved in a transaction. It should also assist you to analyse the broader money laundering, terrorism financing risks of a transaction or pattern of transactions by giving you improved knowledge of who the person is behind an external wallet that your customer is transacting with. This can include identifying lower risk transactions as well as higher risk transactions. While I'm talking about sanctions, I've been asked to say a little bit more today given developments in Ukraine and some of the discussion in earlier sessions this week. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is, of course, the sanctions regulator in Australia, and you should look at their website for information about what sanctions measures apply. There are a range of sanctions measures in place, including targeted financial sanctions that require you to freeze assets of designated persons and entities and prevent assets being made available to them. But there's also an intersection with AML CTF obligations, and even without the travel rule, there are things you can and should be doing. All reporting entities, including DCEs, are required to have risk-based systems and controls in place in their transaction monitoring programs to identify and report suspicious matters. This obligation includes monitoring for and reporting suspicions of efforts by individuals or businesses to avoid Australia's sanctions laws. In light of recent developments, reporting entities should be implementing risk-based systems and controls to monitor for transactions suspected to be connected with persons or entities designated for Russia sanctions. What level of transaction monitoring is appropriate for your business will depend on the risks presented by your customer base, the products and services you provide, the delivery channels by which you provide them, and of course, the foreign jurisdictions you're dealing with. For DCEs, risk-based transaction monitoring could, of course, include the use of blockchain analysis tools to understand the risk of wallet addresses your customers are transacting with. Any suspicion must, of course, be reported to AUSTRAC as a suspicious matter report. Such reporting helps AUSTRAC to develop actionable financial intelligence to assist partners in detecting sanctions evasion, and are available to the AFP, DFAT and other partner agencies. There are also additional reporting requirements to the AFP and the Australian Sanctions Office at DFAT. For example, if you think you hold controlled assets, you must inform the AFP as soon as possible. Now, going back to the travel rule, the FATF standards aren't, of course, legally binding and must be implemented in law by countries before they become mandatory for businesses. Australia has implemented the travel rule for banks since 2006. However, we were an early mover in regulating DCEs, and our legislation predates the FATF's introduction of the travel rule for the sector. In recent years, the government has taken a phased approach to reforming the AML CTF regime. And as you'd recall, the first phase of these reforms in 2018 introduced DCE regulation. Future phases of reform are likely to consider subsequent developments in the FATF standards, although the decision to implement the travel rule in relation to DCEs and the timing for doing so is ultimately a matter for government. In the meantime, there are some questions I'd encourage you to think about. How can regulation make those two important words in the FATF standards immediately and securely become a practical and achievable reality for DCEs, sending payer and payee information? How do we build on the work of organisations like IDAXA in supporting the development of messaging standards to maximise interoperability of technical solutions and minimise friction between legal obligations in different countries? How can we design a legal framework that doesn't pick winners among those travel rules technical solution providers? Where other countries have already implemented the travel rule, what has worked well and where are the lessons that can be learned? And what is the most efficient way for DCEs to do counterparty due diligence to know when they're dealing with other DCEs and have to transmit or expect to receive travel rule information? As I continue to engage in international discussions around the travel rule, I'm interested to hear your views on how to make this work as efficiently as possible. I will finish by just reiterating something I've been saying since 2019. Regardless of the legislative timetable in Australia, Australian DCEs should be thinking about the travel rule now. Different jurisdictions around the world will inevitably start coming on board with new legislation at different times, a challenge known globally as the sunrise issue. Those of you operating in multiple jurisdictions may already have had to move towards travel rule implementation. Those of you who deal with counterparts overseas may increasingly be requested to provide or receive travel rule information when involved in transfers of virtual assets. Some jurisdictions may begin requiring that their DCEs only deal with other DCEs that comply with the travel rule, while others may start classifying transactions lacking travel rule information as higher risk. While there is a lot of work to be done and consultations to be undertaken in Australia, the future direction of AML CTF regulation globally is firming up. I'd encourage you to take advantage of the information that is out there, including the October 2021 FATF updated guidance on the FATF website, to ensure you're ready. I know from spending many nights developing and negotiating it within the FATF that it is a fairly dense piece of work, but it is a genuine effort by regulators globally to develop a consistent approach and support the public and private sectors to understand the FATF requirements. And I look forward to engaging meaningfully with you about options to ensure that future reforms in Australia are practical and achieve the outcomes most of us want, to protect the sector for legitimate users and ensure that criminals and their associates are kept